All right, folks, settle in, grab your questionable late-night beverage of choice. Mine's currently a lukewarm mug of, well, let's just say it's caffeinated and probably illegal in 37 states. Because tonight on Beyond Midnight, we're not just scratching the surface of history. Oh no, we're digging in with a pilum, a shovel, and maybe a very tired, slightly unhinged historian who hasn't seen sunlight since, I don't know, the fall of Constantinople. We're talking about what life was really like in a Roman legion. And trust me, it wasn't all glorious parades and shiny armor. Think less Game of Thrones, epic battles, and more corporate retreat from hell meets extreme survival camping trip meets your gym membership, but if the gym instructor could legally execute you. So you're a young Roman, or perhaps a freshly conquered Gaul with an unfortunate knack for looking strong. You've heard the whispers, the legends of the legions, the invincible war machine that carved an empire out of sheer will, bronze, and a terrifying amount of marching. Maybe your family's starving, maybe you've got a debt collector breathing down your neck, or maybe you just genuinely believe in the glory of Rome. Whatever your reason, you decide to sign up. No LinkedIn profiles here, no fancy HR interviews. You just show up, you're vetted for basic physical fitness. Can you stand up without falling over? Great. Can you hold a sword without immediately dropping it on your foot? Even better. And suddenly, congratulations, you're now property of the Roman state. Your life, your limbs, your very soul now belong to the eagle. And let me tell you, that eagle, it's a hungry, hungry bird. Your first taste of legionary life isn't the thrill of battle, no, it's the grind. We're talking boot camp on steroids, then multiplied by 1,000, then set on fire. The Romans understood something fundamental. An army isn't just a collection of individuals. It's a single, cohesive, deadly organism. And to forge that organism, you break down the individual first. Imagine waking up before the sun every single day. Not because you want to, but because if you don't, a centurion with a vine stick and a perpetually bad mood will ensure you do. Your days are a relentless cycle of physical exertion. Running, marching, drilling, digging, building. Every muscle you didn't know you had screams in protest. Then those muscles you did know about decide to join the chorus. Then the bones. Then your very spirit. They're not just training you to fight, they're training you to endure. To endure pain, hunger, exhaustion, boredom, fear, and the sheer, mind-numbing monotony of it all. They'll teach you to march. Oh, they'll teach you to march. Not just a stroll in the park, folks. We're talking forced marches, fully loaded, miles upon miles, day after day, in all weather. 20 Roman miles in 5 hours, they'd expect. That's about 18.5 modern miles, with 60-80 pounds of gear strapped to your back. Imagine hiking the Appalachian Trail, but you're doing it in a group of 5,000 other sweaty, grimy, irritable men. And if you fall behind, you don't get a nice hot shower and a protein bar at the end. You get, well, let's just say it's not a pleasant conversation with the aforementioned centurion. They built roads not just for easy travel, but because their legions needed to move fast. They were the original road warriors, except instead of motorcycles, they had calloused feet and an unshakable sense of purpose. Or at least, an unshakable sense of if I stop, I'm dead. And what about that 60-80 pounds of gear? Oh, let's unpack that, shall we? Because this isn't just your weekend camping pack. This is your entire life, your survival, and your identity all strapped to your back. You've got your Larica segmentata, that iconic segmented plate armor, surprisingly flexible, surprisingly effective, and surprisingly heavy. Your scutum, the massive rectangular shield, your mobile fortress. Your gladius, the short, brutal stabbing sword, designed for close quarters mayhem. Your pilum, a javelin with a clever design that made it bend on impact, rendering it useless to the enemy. But wait, there's more. You've got your personal tools, a shovel, a pickaxe, a basket for moving earth, a saw, a sickle. Why? Because every Roman legionary was not just a soldier. He was an engineer, a builder, a pioneer. They didn't wait for supply lines to bring them a prefab camp. They built their camp every single night. A ditch, a rampart, watchtowers, tents, a fully fortified mini-city, erected in a matter of hours by men who had just marched 20 miles. Try doing that after a long day at the office, folks. I'll wait. Then there's the sarsana, the legionary's personal pack. This wasn't just your clothes. This was your cooking pot, your rations for several days, hardtack, dried meat, maybe some cheese if you were lucky, your water skin, your spare caligy, those iconic hobnailed sandals, because worn-out sandals meant worn-out feet, and worn-out feet meant you couldn't march. And all of this was carried on a furca, a T-shaped pole that rested on your shoulder. So imagine, if you will, the Roman legionary, a walking, sweating, grumbling, highly disciplined fortress of a man, carrying enough weight to make a modern backpacker weep, all while maintaining formation, keeping pace, and being ready to drop it all and fight at a moment's notice. They were the ultimate multitaskers, except their multitasking involved life-or-death scenarios and very heavy lifting. Life in camp when you weren't marching or fighting was still no picnic. Hygiene, let's just say it was. Practical, communal latrines, often just trenches. Bathing, when possible, was a luxury, not a daily ritual. Disease was a constant companion, often more deadly than any barbarian horde. Food was basic, designed for sustenance, not culinary delight. Think ancient military MREs, but probably less appealing. Discipline was ironclad. Minor infractions could lead to severe beatings with the vine stick. More serious offenses, like desertion or cowardice in battle, could mean decimation, where 1 in 10 men from a unit was randomly selected and beaten to death by his comrades. It was brutal, yes, but it instilled a terrifying level of cohesion and mutual reliance. You didn't just fight for Rome, you fought for the guy next to you, because your life depended on his discipline, and his life depended on yours. And if either of you messed up, the consequences for everyone could be dire. But here's the kicker, the truly mind-bending part of it all. These weren't just automatons. They were men with hopes, fears, families back home, or the hope of one someday. They gambled, they drank, they told crude jokes, they formed deep bonds of brotherhood that transcended social class or origin. They learned trades, carpentry, masonry, engineering skills that made them invaluable even outside of combat. They were the backbone of the empire, not just its fighting arm. They built the roads, the bridges, the aqueducts, the cities that still stand today. When they weren't fighting, they were building. When they weren't building, they were training. When they weren't training, they were, well, probably still training, or digging, or marching. The Roman legion wasn't just a military unit, it was a total lifestyle. A harsh, demanding, often brutal lifestyle, but one that offered a path to citizenship, a steady, if meager, paycheck, and the chance to be part of something truly monumental. They weren't just fighting wars, they were expanding a civilization, spreading Roman law, Roman language, Roman culture. They were the ultimate agents of globalization, with swords instead of spreadsheets. And when it came to battle, all that training, all that discipline, all that suffering coalesced into an unstoppable force. Imagine a solid wall of shields, bristling with pila, advancing with an unflinching, rhythmic stride. The enemy would throw themselves against this human anvil, only to be met by the relentless, methodical thrusts of the gladius, the disciplined rotation of ranks, the unyielding will of men who had been forged into a single, terrifying weapon. It wasn't about individual heroism, it was about the collective. The legion moved as one, fought as one, and conquered as one. And that, my friends, is just the start of what life was like for these incredible, terrifying, utterly fascinating men. We've barely scratched the surface of their daily routines, their pay, their camps, their engineering feats, their social lives, their retirement, or the sheer psychological toll of constant warfare. But don't you worry, because this insomniac historian is just getting warmed up. We've got so much more to uncover about the Roman legion, about the sheer audacity of their ambition, the grit of their soldiers, and the enduring legacy they left behind. So if you're ready for more tales from the dusty, blood-soaked annals of history, seen through the bleary eyes of your humble host, then you know what to do. Stay tuned, because Beyond Midnight is just getting started. We talked about the sheer, mind-numbing physicality, the marching, the building, the constant state of being a human pack mule. But what happened when they weren't marching? What was life like in the relative comfort of a permanent camp or a temporary castrum? Well, first off, let's dispel any romantic notions of soldiers kicking back with a cold one, playing cards and swapping war stories all day. Downtime for a Roman legionary was less Netflix and chill and more still working, just not actively being shot at. Even in a permanent fortress, the grind continued. Your day would still start before dawn, often with a bugle call that would make even the most dedicated snooze-button enthusiast weep. Then came the morning rituals, ablutions, a quick splash of water maybe, breakfast, more hardtack, more dried meat, maybe some porridge if you were lucky, and then straight to work. Work, you ask? Yes, work. A legionary's job wasn't just fighting, it was maintaining the war machine. This meant endless drills, practicing formations, weapon handling, mock battles. You'd swing that gladius until your arm felt like jelly, thrust that pilum until your shoulders screamed, and march in formation until your feet were numb. Repetition was key. They wanted these movements to be muscle memory, so ingrained that you'd perform them perfectly, even when surrounded by the chaos of battle, with arrows whistling past your ears and barbarians screaming in your face. But it wasn't just combat drills. Remember how I said every legionary was also an engineer? Well, that wasn't just for building temporary camps. They were constantly maintaining the permanent ones too. Repairing walls, digging ditches, cleaning out the latrines, someone had to do it, and it probably wasn't the centurion. Maintaining the roads leading to and from the camp, even quarrying stone or felling timber. Think of it as a permanent, extremely intensive construction and maintenance crew with swords, and if you weren't good at one thing, you'd be assigned to something else. There was no idle hands in the Roman army. An idle soldier was a bored soldier, and a bored soldier was a potential troublemaker. Or worse, a soldier who wasn't ready for battle. Let's talk about the food, because sustenance was absolutely critical. You're burning thousands of calories a day, so you need fuel. The staple was grain, usually wheat, sometimes barley, which they'd grind into flour to make bread or porridge. This wasn't artisanal sourdough, folks. This was dense, heavy, often stale bread that could probably double as a weapon in a pinch. Along with that, you'd get some form of dried meat, pork or beef, heavily salted to preserve it, cheese, and perhaps some olives or dried fruit if the supply lines were good. Vegetables were less common, unless you were foraging or they were grown locally. Water was, of course, essential, often mixed with pasca, a sour wine vinegar drink that helped purify the water and replenish electrolytes. Sounds delicious, right? No, it sounds like something you'd give to a prisoner of war. But it kept them alive and functioning, and if the supply lines broke down, well, then you learned to forage, or you learned what your sandals tasted like. Desperate times, desperate measures. And how did they get paid for this grueling existence? Well, it wasn't exactly a king's ransom. A legionary's pay, or stipendium, varied over time, but generally it was enough to live on, but not enough to get rich. And a significant portion of it was often deducted directly at source for things like food, clothing, new equipment, and even burial expenses. Think of it as the original 401k, except the K stood for kicking the bucket. What was left was often spent on gambling. Dice games were popular, visiting the local lupanar brothel, or perhaps buying a bit of extra food or wine from camp followers. Some might save up to send money home to their families, or to put aside for their retirement, a concept we'll get to, because it was a long, hard road to get there. The hierarchy within the legion was strict, and everyone knew their place. At the bottom, you had the miles gregarious, the common foot soldier, the backbone of the army. Above them were the immunes, soldiers who were excused from manual labor duties because they had specialized skills, medics, medici, engineers, architecti, blacksmiths, fabri, scribes, libraret, even horn blowers, cornicines. These guys were invaluable, the support staff that kept the entire operation running. Then you had the non-commissioned officers, the backbone of discipline. The tesserarius was the guard commander, responsible for the watchword and security. The optio was the centurion's second in command, essentially his executive officer, responsible for drilling and ensuring orders were followed. And above them all, the legendary centurion. These were the career soldiers, the grizzled veterans who had worked their way up through the ranks. They were the heart and soul of the legion, leading from the front, often the first into the fray and the last to retreat. They were tough, uncompromising, and utterly essential. Each legion had 60 centurions, commanding a centuria of around 80 men. They carried the vitus, the vine stick, a symbol of their authority, and they weren't afraid to use it. A centurion's stick could enforce discipline, correct a mistake, or simply remind a lazy soldier that he was still alive and breathing. Above the centurions were the primus pilus, the senior centurion of the first cohort, a truly legendary figure, and then the tribunes, young aristocratic officers, often serving for a few years as part of their political career. And finally, at the top, the legatus, the legionary commander, usually a senator of high standing, appointed by the emperor himself. It was a clear chain of command, from the emperor down to the lowliest recruit, ensuring orders were followed without question. Discipline, as I mentioned, was brutal but effective. Beyond the vine stick, there were various punishments. Flogging was common. Being forced to stand guard outside the camp all night without your armor was a deeply humiliating and potentially dangerous punishment. For more serious offenses, there was fustuarium, where the offender was beaten to death by his comrades with sticks and stones, a public and terrifying deterrent. And for collective failures, there was decimation, the ultimate horror, where 1 in 10 men of a disgraced unit was executed by the others. It was designed to instill fear, yes, but also to forge an unbreakable bond of collective responsibility. You didn't want to be the reason your buddies drew the short straw. But it wasn't all stick. There was a carrot, too. Rewards for bravery were given, from honorary collars and armbands to cash bonuses, promotions, and even the highly coveted corona civica, a crown of oak leaves awarded for saving a Roman citizen's life in battle. These recognitions were vital for morale and for fostering a sense of pride and competition within the ranks. And what about when things went wrong, medically speaking? Well, ancient Roman medicine was surprisingly advanced for its time, but still primitive by modern standards. Each legion had its own medical staff, the medici we talked about. They were trained in basic surgery, setting bones, treating wounds, and even some herbal remedies. They had surgical instruments that looked terrifyingly familiar to modern tools. Wounds were often cleaned with wine or vinegar to prevent infection, and rudimentary bandages were applied. But without antibiotics, even a minor cut could turn septic and become a death sentence. Amputation was common for severe limb injuries. Disease, as I said, was a constant threat. Dysentery, malaria, pneumonia, all swept through crowded camps with devastating effect. You were more likely to die from a bad stomach bug than from a barbarian's sword. But the Romans did understand hygiene better than many of their contemporaries, with their latrines and bathhouses, when available, which helped somewhat. When the legions weren't fighting or building or drilling, what did they do? Well, the Roman Empire was vast, and many legions spent years, even decades, garrisoned in the same frontier forts. This led to a different kind of life. Soldiers would form relationships with local women, even if technically forbidden until the 3rd century AD. Cannae, civilian settlements, would spring up outside the fort walls, full of merchants, artisans, and families of the soldiers. These forts became centers of Romanization, spreading Latin, Roman law, and Roman culture to the far-flung corners of the empire. When a legionary retired, he might choose to settle in one of these cannae, contributing to the local economy and becoming a Roman citizen in a new land. Religion and superstition were deeply ingrained in military life. Every legion had its own sacred standards, the eagle aquila being the most revered, followed by the signa unit standards. Losing an eagle in battle was the ultimate disgrace, a stain on the legion's honor that could only be redeemed by its recovery. Sacrifices to the gods, especially Mars, god of war, and Jupiter, king of the gods, were common before battles or important events to ensure divine favor. Omens were carefully watched, and priests were part of the military entourage. It was a brutal, practical world, but one still very much steeped in the belief that the gods played an active role in human affairs. And yes, there was some downtime. When the hard work was done, soldiers would gamble with dice, tell stories, sing songs, and drink wine or pasca. They would write letters home if they were literate. They would visit the canopy for companionship, a hot meal not cooked by themselves, or just a brief escape from the monotony of military life. The bonds forged in the Legion were incredibly strong, a brotherhood born of shared hardship, danger, and mutual reliance. These were the men who would literally die for you, and you for them. This camaraderie was perhaps the most enduring and important aspect of their lives, making the unbearable bearable. But even with the camaraderie, the psychological toll must have been immense. The constant threat of death, the brutal discipline, the endless marching, the poor food, the endemic disease, the sheer boredom of garrison life interspersed with moments of intense, terrifying violence. There was no concept of PTSD, no therapy. You just endured, and if you didn't, you broke, and breaking in the Roman army was not an option. So you see, the Roman legionary was far more than just a soldier. He was a builder, an engineer, a disciplinarian, a survivor, a pioneer, and often a reluctant agent of imperial expansion. He was a cog in the greatest military machine the world had ever seen, and his life was a testament to human endurance, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of order and conquest. And we're still just scratching the surface of their incredible story. The complexities of their logistics, the politics of their command, the sheer scale of their operations, the impact they had on the world, it's a deep, deep well of history, folks. And this sleepless historian is nowhere near done. So keep that questionable beverage handy, because Beyond Midnight is just getting started. We've covered the marching, the digging, the eating of things that would make a goat reconsider its life choices, and the delightful disciplinary methods. But how, you might ask, did this sprawling, constantly moving, perpetually hungry war machine actually function? How did they feed tens of thousands of men, arm them, clothe them, and get them from one end of the known world to the other, all while fighting off barbarians and the occasional existential crisis? The answer, my friends, is logistics. And let me tell you, if the Roman army was a body, logistics was its circulatory system, its digestive system, and its nervous system all rolled into one glorious, bureaucratic, and utterly essential mess. Without it, the whole thing would have collapsed faster than a poorly built castrum in a hurricane. We're talking about a level of planning and execution that would make modern military strategists weep with envy, or possibly just exhaustion. Imagine trying to feed 5,000 men, plus their horses, their mules, their camp followers, and maybe a few stray dogs every single day for months, even years, while on campaign in hostile territory. This wasn't Amazon Prime, folks. There were no drone deliveries of gluten-free quinoa salads. Food had to be sourced, transported, and distributed. Often, this meant relying on local resources. Conquered territories were expected to provide grain, livestock, and other supplies, a system that often made Roman occupation less than popular, but incredibly effective for the legions. When on the move, vast supply trains, often consisting of hundreds, even thousands of packed mules and wagons, would follow the legions. These trains were slow, vulnerable, and a constant logistical nightmare. Every legionary carried several days' worth of rations on his back, but beyond that, it was all about the supply chain. And it wasn't just food. Think about weapons. Swords break, shields splinter, armor gets damaged, arrows run out. They needed constant resupply of raw materials and skilled artisans, blacksmiths, armorers to repair and replace equipment on the go. Medical supplies were crucial, as were tools for building and digging. It was a monumental undertaking, and the efficiency with which the Romans managed it is a testament to their organizational genius. They built granaries, supply depots, and an unparalleled network of roads and bridges across their empire, all designed to facilitate the rapid movement of legions and their vital supplies. Without these, the empire simply could not have expanded, let alone sustained itself. The roads weren't just for marching. They were the arteries of the empire, pumping lifeblood and hardtack to its furthest extremities. Now let's talk about the main event, the reason they endured all this, battle. Forget what you've seen in the movies, where everyone is a chiseled hero striking dramatic poses. Roman battle was a brutal, terrifying, claustrophobic, and often deeply unglamorous affair. It was less about individual heroism and more about collective, disciplined slaughter. Imagine the scene, two armies arrayed against each other. The air crackles with tension. The roar of thousands of men, the beating of drums, the blare of trumpets, a cacophony designed to intimidate and to steal the nerves. Your heart is pounding in your chest, your mouth is dry, and you're probably trying very hard not to soil your subligation. The centurions are barking orders, their voices hoarse, their vine sticks probably twitching with anticipation. Then the advance. The Roman legions wouldn't typically charge headlong. They would advance in disciplined, measured steps, a slow, inexorable tide of iron and muscle. The first volley would be the pila. Thousands of javelins, each one carefully balanced, designed to pierce enemy shields and armor and then bend, making them useless to throw back. This was the opening punch, designed to disrupt enemy formations and sow chaos. Imagine a hail of metal, each spear a potential death sentence. After the pila volley, it was time for the gladius. This was close quarters, brutal work. The Roman line would clash with the enemy, a thunderous impact of shield against shield, the clang of metal on metal, the screams of the wounded, the smell of sweat, blood, and fear. The scutum, your massive shield, was your primary defense, used not just to block blows, but also to push, shove, and create openings. The gladius, short and sharp, was designed for thrusting. It wasn't about wide, sweeping cuts. It was about rapid, efficient stabs into exposed flesh, the groin, the armpit, the throat. This was a meat grinder, a relentless, methodical process of attrition. The genius of Roman tactics lay in their discipline and their ability to rotate. When the front rank became exhausted, or too many men were lost, they would fall back, and a fresh rank would step forward, maintaining the pressure. This allowed them to fight for hours, wearing down enemies who might be individually braver or stronger, but lacked the Romans' collective endurance and tactical depth. It was a terrifying, almost mechanical process of killing, fueled by training, discipline, and the absolute certainty that if you broke formation, you were probably dead. The noise, the confusion, the sheer visceral horror of it all, it was a sensory overload that few could truly comprehend without experiencing it, and they experienced it again and again. After the battle came the grim work, tending to the wounded, burying the dead, both Roman and enemy, if time allowed, and then often building a fortified camp on the battlefield itself to secure the position. There was no time for emotional debriefing. You survived, you moved on, and you prepared for the next fight. But not every legionary spent their entire career on the battlefield. Many served for decades in the vast network of frontier forts that guarded the empire's borders. This was a different kind of life, less intense combat, more long-term garrison duty. These forts, like Hadrian's Wall in Britannia or the limes along the Rhine and Danube, weren't just military outposts, they were centers of Romanization. A legionary stationed on the frontier might spend years, even decades, in the same fort. They would interact with the local populations, often marrying local women, even if not officially recognized until later periods. As I mentioned, cannae, civilian settlements, would spring up outside the fort walls, growing into towns and even cities. The soldiers would bring Roman law, Roman customs, and the Latin language to these distant lands. They built roads, bridges, temples, bathhouses, and even entire towns. Their presence was a constant, visible manifestation of Roman power and culture. They were not just conquerors, they were colonizers, architects, and administrators. Many of the modern cities across Europe and the Middle East started as Roman legionary camps. This long-term garrison life also meant a different set of challenges. Boredom was a major enemy. Maintaining discipline and morale over years of relative inactivity, punctuated by occasional skirmishes or raids, required different leadership skills. Soldiers would develop strong ties to the local communities, sometimes leading to divided loyalties, but more often fostering a sense of shared identity within the frontier zone. They became the defenders of these nascent Romanized communities, blurring the lines between military and civilian life. And what was the ultimate goal for a Roman legionary? After 20 to 25 years of relentless service, if you survived the battles, the diseases, the accidents, and the brutal discipline, you were granted an honorable discharge, the honus demissio. This was your ticket to a new life. You would receive a lump sum of money, often a substantial amount, and or a grant of land, usually in a newly conquered or developing province. This was Rome's way of rewarding its veterans and, crucially, settling loyal, experienced Roman citizens in strategic areas, further solidifying imperial control. Imagine it, after 2 decades of marching, fighting, digging, and enduring, you were finally free. You could buy a farm, start a family if you hadn't already, and live out your days as a respected member of society, a veteran who had served the greatest empire the world had ever known. Many veterans became prosperous farmers, merchants, or even local magistrates, bringing their Roman discipline and organizational skills to their new communities. Their lives, from their impoverished youth to their hard-earned retirement, were a microcosm of the Roman Empire's relentless drive for expansion and order. But even in retirement, the legionaries' journey wasn't truly over. Their bodies were scarred, their minds perhaps haunted by the horrors they'd witnessed, but their spirits were forged in the crucible of the legion. They were part of a brotherhood that spanned the empire, a living testament to what collective human will and unyielding discipline could achieve. They were the men who built an empire, one grueling march, one terrifying battle, and one perfectly dug ditch at a time. All right, you magnificent history junkies and fellow denizens of the late-night realm. The moon is probably starting to set, my eyes are beginning to feel like sandpaper, and my brain is now running on fumes and sheer historical stubbornness, which means we're perfectly primed to keep digging into the glorious, brutal, and often surprisingly innovative world of the Roman legion. We've covered the core of the legionary experience, the relentless grind, the marching, the fighting, the building, the pasca, the questionable food, and the ever-present threat of a centurion's vine stick. But here's the thing, the legions, as formidable as they were, didn't do it all alone. Oh no, they were the glittering, heavy-hitting core, but the Roman war machine was a much more diverse, nuanced, and utterly fascinating beast. Enter the auxilia. These were the unsung heroes, the crucial support act, the multi-ethnic, multi-talented forces that complemented the heavy infantry legions. If the legionaries were the main course, the auxiliaries were the perfectly chosen side dishes and the exotic spices that made the whole meal sing. They weren't Roman citizens when they enlisted. They were men from conquered territories, allied states, or even tribal groups recruited for their specialized skills. And what did they get for their service? After 25 years of loyal duty, a slightly longer term than legionaries, they and their families would be granted Roman citizenship. This was a massive incentive, a path to social mobility and integration into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. These auxiliary units were incredibly diverse. You had cohorts of infantry, often lighter armed and more agile than legionaries, specializing in skirmishing or rapid maneuvers. Then there were the elite, the cavalry units, drawn from regions famous for their horsemanship, Gauls, Germans, Numidians. These guys were the eyes and ears of the army, the shock troops for flanking maneuvers, the pursuit force after a broken enemy. Imagine a legionary, bogged down in a shield wall, suddenly seeing a wave of Celtic cavalry, screaming and painted, thundering past him to hit the enemy's flank. It was a beautiful, terrifying symphony of destruction. But it didn't stop there. You had archers from Syria, slingers from the Balearic Islands, javelin throwers from North Africa. Each unit brought its unique regional fighting style and weaponry to the Roman cause. This meant the Roman army wasn't just a monolithic block of heavy infantry. It was a flexible, adaptable force capable of dealing with any enemy, on any terrain, in any fighting style. Need to chase down fast-moving skirmishers, send in the Numidian cavalry. Facing a heavily armored foe, the legions will grind them down while Syrian archers rain death from a distance. The auxiliaries were the reason the Roman army was so versatile, so capable of dominating a continent with wildly different fighting traditions. They were the original force multipliers, and their contribution was absolutely indispensable. Now let's pivot from the battlefield to the building site, because the Roman army wasn't just about fighting, it was about creating. We've touched on their daily camp construction, but that was just the warm-up act. The Roman legions were arguably the greatest engineers of the ancient world. They didn't just build roads, they built infrastructure on a scale that beggars belief. Think about siege warfare. When a city refused to open its gates, the legions didn't just stand around looking menacing. Oh no, they became an unstoppable force of destruction. They'd build massive siege towers, taller than the city walls, complete with drawbridges to deposit legionaries directly onto the ramparts. They'd construct enormous battering rams, often housed in protective sheds, to pound away at gates and walls until they crumbled. And then there were the catapults, catapulti, and ballistae, ancient artillery pieces capable of hurling massive stones or giant arrows with terrifying force, smashing fortifications and terrifying defenders. They could even construct elaborate tunnels under city walls to undermine them, or build massive circumvallation lines, walls around the besieged city to prevent anyone from getting in or out, and contravallation lines, walls facing outward to protect against relief armies. The Siege of Alesia, where Julius Caesar's legions built two sets of fortifications, one facing the city and one facing a massive Gallic relief army, is a legendary testament to their engineering prowess and sheer audacity. And bridges, forget your flimsy rope bridges. When Caesar needed to cross the Rhine, a river that was both wide and fast, he didn't wait for boats. He had his legions construct a massive wooden pile bridge over 1,300 feet long in just 10 days. 10 days, with basic tools and brute force. This wasn't just a military feat, it was a psychological weapon, demonstrating to the Germans that the Romans could go anywhere, do anything. These weren't just temporary structures. Many of their bridges and aqueducts, built by legionaries, still stand today, a testament to their incredible skill and the durability of their construction methods. Beyond military engineering, the legions were also instrumental in building the civilian infrastructure of the empire. Aqueducts, those magnificent arch structures that carried fresh water to cities, were often built by legionary engineers. Public baths, temples, forums, much of the monumental architecture of the Roman Empire was conceived and executed by military engineers and their legionary workforces. They were the ultimate civil engineers, laying the foundation for Roman power and prosperity, one perfectly cut stone and one perfectly straight road at a time. Their camps, when they became permanent, often evolved into major cities, places like Chester Deva Victrix in England, Vienna, Vindubona in Austria, or Mainz, Mogontiacum in Germany, all started as legionary fortresses. And while we're talking about the Roman war machine, let's not forget the unsung heroes of the waves, the Roman Navy. Often overshadowed by the land legions, the Navy was absolutely crucial for logistics, coastal defense, and projecting Roman power across the Mediterranean and beyond. They transported legions, supplied distant outposts, protected trade routes from pirates, and launched amphibious invasions. Without their control of the seas, the vast, dispersed Roman Empire simply couldn't have functioned. They might not have had the iconic Larica segmentata or gladius, but their triremes and quinquiremes were just as vital to Rome's dominance. So when you picture a Roman legionary, don't just see a stoic warrior. See a multi-skilled, adaptable, and incredibly resilient individual. See a man who could march 20 miles with a heavy pack, then spend the evening digging a ditch, then wake up to fight a battle, and then if he survived, help build a bridge or an aqueduct. He was a master of survival, a disciplined fighter, and an indispensable cog in the greatest empire-building machine the world has ever known. And what about the human element, beyond the grit and the glory? These were men from all corners of the empire, thrown together by fate and the whims of the emperor. They forged bonds that were stronger than family, born of shared suffering, shared triumphs, and the absolute reliance on the man next to you. They learned each other's languages, shared stories, probably grumbled about the food, and dreamt of home or a better life. The Roman army was a melting pot, a crucible where different cultures met, clashed, and ultimately, often blended. This cultural exchange happened not just with the conquered peoples, but within the ranks themselves, creating a unique military subculture. They had their own songs, their own jokes, their own superstitions. They would gamble their meager pay, share their wine, and find solace in the company of their comrades. When not on duty, the canopy outside the forts became their escape, a place for a hot meal, a bit of female company, or just a brief respite from the relentless military routine. Many soldiers formed long-term relationships, even starting families, with the understanding that these families were often informal until official recognition came later in the empire. These were not just killing machines, they were human beings, with the same needs, desires, and vulnerabilities as anyone else. They just happened to live in a world where those needs were met under the most brutal and demanding conditions imaginable. The psychological toll, as I mentioned before, was immense. The constant threat of death, the witnessing of unspeakable violence, the sheer monotony of garrison life, the isolation from home. There was no support system for mental health as we understand it. You coped or you broke. But the very structure of the Legion, its strict discipline, its focus on collective identity, and the deep bonds of brotherhood, paradoxically, provided a kind of psychological armor. You weren't alone, you were part of something vast and powerful, and your comrades depended on you as much as you depended on them. That shared burden, that collective identity, was a powerful force that kept men going even when everything else screamed for them to quit. And when, after all of this, after 25 years of enduring the unimaginable, a legionary finally received his honesta missio, it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a rebirth, a new life, a new identity, a chance to finally build something for himself and his family outside the shadow of the eagle. Many chose to settle near their old forts, becoming respected members of the canopy that had grown into towns, bringing Roman culture and stability to the frontier. They were the living embodiment of Rome's reach, its power, and its enduring legacy. We've talked about the common soldier, the centurion, the auxiliaries. But within the Legion, there were even more specialized roles, each carrying immense responsibility and often a heavy symbolic weight. Imagine the aquilifer, the eagle bearer. This wasn't just a guy holding a flag. The aquila, the legionary eagle standard, was the very soul of the Legion. It represented its honor, its spirit, its connection to Jupiter and Rome itself. To lose the eagle in battle was the ultimate disgrace, a stain that could only be cleansed by its recovery, no matter the cost. The aquilifer was a highly respected, heavily armored veteran, chosen for his bravery and unwavering loyalty. He would fight to the death to protect that eagle, and often did. Then you had the signiferi, the standard bearers for each cohort and century, carrying the signa, smaller standards adorned with medallions, wreaths, and symbols representing their specific unit. These standards were vital for communication and cohesion on the battlefield, allowing commanders to see where their units were, and for soldiers to rally around a visible point. Losing a signum was also a grave matter. And don't forget the imaginifer, who carried the imago, a portrait of the reigning emperor. This was a constant, visible reminder of who they served, a symbol of imperial authority right there on the battlefield. And how did they communicate amidst the deafening roar of battle? Through the cornicines and tubicenses, the horn and trumpet blowers. These guys weren't just musicians, they were vital communicators. Their calls signaled advances, retreats, changes in formation, and charges. They had to be loud, clear, and perfectly timed because a misinterpreted bugle call could mean disaster. Imagine trying to coordinate thousands of men in formation without radios or even flags, just the sound of a horn cutting through the chaos. These were the ancient world's command and control specialists, using sound to guide the tide of battle. But here's the kicker, the truly profound aspect that elevates the Roman legion beyond just a military force, their immense political power. These legions weren't just tools of the state. They were often the makers and breakers of the state. For centuries, Roman emperors rose and fell not by popular vote or senatorial decree, but by the will of the legions. A legion's loyalty, or its decision to declare its own commander-emperor, could plunge the entire empire into civil war. Think about the year of the four emperors in 69 AD. After Nero's suicide, 4 different men, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, seized power, each backed by different legions or military factions. Their reigns were short, brutal, and utterly dependent on their ability to command the loyalty of the armed forces. Emperors learned quickly that they had to pay their troops well, keep them busy, and ensure their loyalty through regular donatives, bonuses, and personal charisma. Neglect the legions and you risked a coup. This dynamic meant that the lives of legionaries, even the lowest rank, were intimately tied to the highest political machinations of the empire. Their hands, calloused from digging and fighting, literally held the fate of Rome. This political reality also shaped the legionaries' perspective. While they fought for Rome, they also fought for their general, their emperor, their legion's honor. Their identity was deeply rooted in their unit, and that unit could become a powerful force in its own right, a kingmaker or king-killer in the grand political game. This constant tension between serving the abstract idea of Rome and the very real, often self-serving interests of their commanders and fellow soldiers added another layer of complexity to their lives. Over the centuries, the Roman legion evolved, from the citizen soldiers of the Republic to the professional armies of Marius reforms, to the vast frontier forces of the Empire, and finally the more dispersed, mobile units of the late Empire. Their equipment changed, their tactics adapted, but the core principles of discipline, engineering, and logistical prowess remained. They were a testament to adaptability and continuous improvement, a military machine that refined itself over a millennium. So what is the enduring legacy of these men, these incredible, terrifying, and ultimately very human individuals? It's not just the roads that still crisscross Europe or the aqueducts that stand as monuments to their engineering genius. It's the very concept of a professional standing army, trained, equipped, and organized to a degree unprecedented in the ancient world. It's the principles of military discipline, logistics, and command structure that are still studied and applied by armies today. It's the spread of Roman law, language, and culture that laid the foundations for much of Western civilization. Every time you see a straight road in Europe that seems to ignore the terrain, think of a Roman legionary with a groma surveying the path. Every time you hear a word derived from Latin, remember the soldiers who spoke it in distant lands. Every time you marvel at an ancient ruin, remember the hands that built it, hands that were just as likely to wield a shovel as a sword. The life of a Roman legionary was a paradox, a life of relentless hardship and brutal discipline, yet also a path to opportunity, brotherhood, and a profound sense of purpose. They were the ultimate agents of a vast, ambitious empire, enduring unimaginable conditions to carve out a legacy that still resonates 2 millennia later. They were not just warriors, they were the very bedrock of Roman power, the living embodiment of its will to conquer, to build, and to endure. And that, my friends, is where we must, for now, leave our journey into the true life of a Roman legionary. My voice is hoarse, my brain is fried, and I'm pretty sure I just saw a Roman centurion march past my window. It's been a grueling but utterly fascinating deep dive, peeling back the layers of myth and glory to reveal the gritty human truth beneath. Thank you for joining me on this late-night expedition into the past, here on Beyond Midnight. This sleepless historian is finally signing off. For now, there are countless other untold stories, forgotten battles, and overlooked lives waiting in the shadows of history. So keep your minds open, your curiosity sharp, and your questionable beverages close at hand. We'll be back because the past never truly sleeps, and neither, apparently, do I. Good night, or rather good morning, you magnificent history buffs. Stay curious.